Welcome back to Movie Stories. Today's story is a drama and thriller film from 2017 titled, The Book of Henry. There will be spoilers. Watch out and take care. In a small suburban Hudson Valley town, 11-year-old boy genius Henry and his little brother Peter stand on the sidewalk waiting for the school bus. When the bus arrives, the brothers get in, and out of nowhere, a boy shoves Peter. Without paying the bully any mind, Henry quickly picks his brother up. In school, Henry's class has been asked to speak on the topic My Legacy. When it is Henry's turn, he delivers an insightful speech on what legacy truly means, and just as his presentation comes to a close, the bell rings. As the other students clear out of the classroom, Henry and his teacher discuss the prospects of him attending a school for the gifted. After school, Henry and Peter wait for their mother Susan to pick them up. While they wait, Henry uses the school phone to monitor his stock market investments. Eventually, Susan arrives, apologizes for being late, and drives them home in her rickety old car. At home, Henry and Peter retire to their treehouse, where Henry assembles a Rube Goldberg machine. When night falls, Susan runs a bath for Peter and goes down to the living room to play video games. Meanwhile, Henry goes over their monthly financial statement and tells her that she ought to at least take a look at their account documents, but she brushes him off. Later that night, in her son's shared bedroom, Susan reads them a children's book that she wrote, and Henry teases her about the book's storyline. After the book reading is over, Susan tells Peter that they cannot have movie night the next day because she has to work the dinner shift. Hearing this, Henry tells his mom that she need not continue working as a waitress since it is no longer necessary, but she ignores him and leaves after kissing them goodnight. The following day, Susan prepares breakfast for the boys, but their peaceful meal is interrupted when their neighbor Glenn yells out her name. Accompanied by her two sons, Susan heads out, and Glenn tells her to keep her unraked leaves from flying to his lawn. After the issue has been resolved, Glenn's stepdaughter Christina, who is also Henry's classmate, comes out to say hello. As the trio head back inside, Susan teases Henry about his obvious crush on Christina. After breakfast, Susan heads over to the ice cream parlor, where she and her best friend Sheila work as waitresses. After the pair are done exchanging pleasantries, Susan's boss approaches her to discuss her preferred payment method. Instead of just picking one, she replies saying she would have to consult Henry first. At school the next day, Henry is playing a game of checkers when Peter comes running to ask for his help to retrieve a medal that Morris, the school's notorious bully, has taken. Immediately Henry follows Peter to the school courtyard, but while Peter heads over to Morris, Henry notices Christina sitting by herself and stops to make small talk. In the time that it takes Henry to converse with Christina, Morris breaks the medal and begins to rough Peter up. Noticing the commotion, Henry goes to rescue his brother, but instead of being thankful, Peter is furious, asking where he was in the first place. Back at home, Peter is still mad at Henry, but Henry eventually cheers him up using a makeshift snow machine. As the siblings continue to play in the fake snow, Susan returns home with Sheila. After Sheila says hi to Peter and banters with Henry for a bit, she follows Susan into the living room, and the two women proceed to get drunk and make jokes deep into the night. When bedtime rolls around, Henry puts his brother Peter to bed. At midnight, Henry wakes up suddenly, and after taking painkillers, he walks over to his bedroom window, which oversees the house next door. While looking out the window, Henry witnesses a suspicious situation involving Christina and her stepfather Glenn, who became her guardian after her mother passed away. The following day at breakfast, Henry is visibly upset by what he saw, but when Susan asks what is wrong, he says he has a headache. When it is time to drop the children at school, Susan notices Christina sitting on the front porch of her house and offers her a lift. In the car, Henry asks Christina if she is okay, but she shrugs his question off. In class, Henry's teacher announces that there is to be a talent show, but Henry pays her no mind. Instead, he continues to observe Christina, and when she leaves a free donut untouched, instead of wolfing it down like the rest of the class, he walks out of the classroom enraged and makes a beeline for the principal's office. In the office, Henry, who is clearly outraged, attempts to convince the principal Janice that Christina is being abused by her stepfather Glenn. Still, instead of swinging into action, Janice shuts Henry down by saying that Glenn is the police commissioner and, as such, she will not accuse him of child abuse without clear-cut evidence to back up the claim. Frustrated, Henry tells her he will handle the situation himself. That afternoon, Susan picks the kids up late again, and after they stop by Sheila's, the family of three head to the grocery store. In the store, Henry sees a man maltreating his partner, but Susan tells him to look away because their interference would only make it worse. Back at home, while Peter and Susan unload the groceries, Henry goes inside and places a call to Child Protective Services via their anonymous report line. He hurriedly gives them Christina's address and Glenn's name before hanging up. After that, Henry goes outside to help bring in the groceries. As he reaches for a paper bag, Christina walks up to him and gives him a medal of hers to replace the one that Morris broke. As the two talk, Susan comes out, and she makes small talk with Christina about the upcoming talent show. In the end, it is decided that Susan will take Christina to the show while Glenn will pick her up. A few days later, George Sickelman, who Henry later learns is the social services director and Glenn's relative, shows up at Glenn's doorstep to investigate Henry's claims, but instead of prying, the man stands on the porch, exchanges pleasantries with Glenn and barely spares Christina a second glance. Henry watches the events unfold using binoculars, and he is greatly disappointed by the outcome. Shortly after George leaves, Henry gets on his bicycle and begins a string of strange activities. First, he rides to a bridge and stakes it out, making sure to write down his findings in a notebook. Next, he gets his brother Peter to help him stake out the land surrounding their treehouse. After that, Peter goes out once again and purchases 2 books on crime scene investigation. With his newly purchased books in his bag, Henry rides his bike to a store that sells arms and manages to sneak in unnoticed. Inside, he witnesses an illegal weapon sale, and he writes down the details in his notebook. Later that night, Susan is awoken by Peter's screams, and she rushes into her son's room to see Henry on the ground having a seizure. Peter calls 911, and Henry is taken to the hospital. After Henry tells the doctor that he has had a persistent headache for several months, necessary tests are carried out, and the doctor discovers that he has a mass in his head. Following this discovery, the doctor tells Susan that Henry needs immediate surgery. Henry spends the night in the hospital, with Peter and Susan by his side. The next morning, the doctor asks to speak to Henry and Susan privately. With a heavy heart, he reveals that he has a tumor in his head, and Henry asks to see the MRI. He understands that nothing can be done and asks to be left alone. After coming to terms with his fate, Henry continues to read his crime investigation books, pausing only to add arrows to an illustration of the bridge he visited earlier in his notebook. As time passes, the family of 3 is shrouded by a cloud of gloom, and Susan and Peter try to spend as much time with Henry as possible. One day, when all 3 of them are in the hospital room together, Henry asks Peter to bring him some ice cream. After Peter leaves, Henry asks Susan to bring him the family's financial statements and other documents so he can look over them one last time, but Susan gets emotional and leaves the room. When Peter returns with the ice cream, the 2 brothers decide they no longer want it. Instead, Henry pleads with Peter to ensure that their mother reads his red notebook after his passing. The conversation takes an emotional turn, and the 2 brothers cry in each other's arms. The next day, Susan does as Henry said and brings their financial documents to him in the hospital. While working on his computer, Henry attempts to give his mother a crash course on investment and stock monitoring, but she has an outrage saying she doesn't care about any of those things. When Susan finally calms down, she apologizes for her behavior, and the 2 have an emotional moment. That night, Henry passes away in Susan's arms, and his family goes into mourning. Christina helps bring Peter home from school, and he falls asleep in Henry's bed with his walkie-talkie in hand. Susan, who is also teary-eyed, walks into the bedroom, turns off the walkie-talkie and kisses Peter goodnight. The next day when Peter returns from school, he finds his mom baking up a storm. As the 2 converse about Henry passing, Susan spirals out of control and has a mental breakdown. Peter attempts to console her, but they are interrupted by the doorbell. When Susan answers the door, she sees Dr. Daniels, the doctor who treated Henry during his time in the hospital. Noticing Susan's confusion, he reminds her that they have an appointment and tells her that he came to check up on her and Peter. Susan lets Dr. Daniels into the kitchen, and when he spots Peter, he approaches him immediately. To ensure that Peter is safe, the doctor gives the youngster his card and tells him to reach out whenever. Soon after Henry's passing, Susan returns to work, but after she drinks half a customer's Coke in a bid to tell if it is diet or not, her boss tells her that she resumed too early and should take more time off. After school that day, Peter goes straight home to the bedroom he once shared with his brother. While sitting on the bed, he catches sight of Henry's red notebook and remembers his brother's instructions. Quickly, Peter picks up the book and flips through it. Immediately Susan returns home, Peter comes running down the stairs, red notebook in hand. Before handing it over, he tells his mom that he believes Henry wants them to kill Glenn. After looking through the book, Susan learns that Glenn abuses his stepdaughter Christina. She also learns that before his passing, Henry tried all available conventional methods to help Christina but to no avail, which is why he devised his foolproof plan. At first, Susan refuses to follow Henry's plans, believing that there must be another way. However, after trying all the conventional methods, she ends up hitting a brick wall. That night, Susan goes to tuck Peter into bed, and from the bedroom window, she witnesses Glenn abuse Christina. Now determined to help Christina by any means necessary, Susan goes back to Henry's book. According to the book, the first step is to open the safe, so Susan heads downstairs. In the safe she finds a tape that Henry pre-recorded. On the tape Henry explains to his mother that he snuck out of the hospital to put everything in place and that now, all she needs to do is follow his instructions. The following day, Susan leaves the house with earphones in her ears, playing Henry's instructions. Step 1 is to stockpile cash, and she does this by visiting 2 different ATMs. Step 2 is to purchase a weapon, so with the cash in her pocket, Susan makes her way to the arms store that Henry staked out earlier. After name-dropping a name that Henry picked up during his stakeout, Susan is allowed to purchase the exact gun that Henry describes in the tape. Step 3 is target practice. Susan returns home and heads to the boys' treehouse deep in the woods. There she practices shooting by following the instructions contained in Henry's tape. After hours of practice, Susan calls it a day and moves on to the next step. She walks to the front of the house, where she finds Glenn raking leaves on his lawn. She tells him she would like to talk to him inside, so he invites her in. Susan briefly says hi to Christina before sitting down with Glenn. Without beating around the bush, she asks Glenn if he has a plan set up for Christina if something were to happen to him, and he replies in the negative. To avoid suspicion, Susan explains that she intends to set up such a plan for Peter and needs guidance. Before taking her leave, Susan asks Glenn to sign a permission slip that lets her take Christina to the talent show, and he does. Back at home, Susan busies herself with forging Glenn's signature for a witness document, but Peter walks in on her. Surprised, Susan quickly puts the papers away and takes Peter back to bed. In the bedroom, the mother and son discuss the upcoming talent show set to hold the next day, and Peter reveals that he will be performing a magic trick. The day arrives, and true to her word, Susan drives Christina and Peter to the talent show. At the show, Susan runs into Dr. Daniels, and Peter reveals that he invited the doctor. When the show starts, Susan sneaks out and sets her stopwatch to 45 minutes. She hurriedly drives home and heads to the treehouse, where she sets up the gun she had been practicing with earlier. Next, Susan proceeds to lure Glenn out of his house by whistling into a walkie-talkie setup. Things go as planned, and Glenn wanders outside to investigate the whistling sounds. As he walks around, Glenn walks directly into the spot where Susan wants him, but just before she pulls the trigger, she sees pictures of Henry as a baby and realizes how preposterous the whole thing is, so she changes her mind. Susan steps out of the treehouse only to find Glenn waiting for her outside. Spotting the gun in her hand, he asks for an explanation. Instead of explaining, Susan tells Glenn that she knows about all he has done and will go to any length to expose him. Unfazed by this revelation, Glenn tells Susan that no one will believe her and threatens to use his position as police commissioner to have her incarcerated. At the talent show, it is Christina's turn to perform, and when she gets on stage, she performs a dance so sad that it brings tears to Principal Janice's eyes. In line with Henry's plan, Susan drives to the bridge he staked out earlier and tosses the gun. After that, she starts speeding back to the elementary school. In his house, Glenn calls his friend in the police department to ask for his help to silence Susan, but he receives a rude shock instead. His friend tells him that he has been reported for child abuse by Principal Janice, and since the case is too broad, an investigation will be opened. He sees police already at his house and decides not to face the disgrace, so he pulls a gun and shoots himself. Susan manages to make it to school in time for Peter's trick. When she walks into the hall, her young son is basking in the spotlight and enjoying the applause. When the show ends, Susan, Peter, and Dr. Daniel stand in the hallway making small talk, but they are interrupted when police sirens sound in the distance. Worried that the police have come for her, Susan excuses herself and heads outside, where she meets Janice standing with the cops. Genuinely confused, Susan asks Janice what is going on. The elementary school principal tells her that Glenn took his life and that a social worker is interviewing Christina. Weeks after the incident, the court awards full custody of Christina to Susan, and in no time, Susan, Christina, and Peter begin to live like one big happy family. The end. Thank you for watching. Subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this.